Welcome everybody to the Spring 2022 lecture series of the School of Architecture and Design at the New York Institute of Technology. I'm Alessandro Melis, the chair of the Lectures and Events Committee, and would like to welcome everybody on behalf of Dean Maria Perbellini. The topic of our lecture series this year is community, and we intend this as communities beyond borders. We think this last aspect is important, especially these days. This will offer opportunities to discuss and debate how the application of architecture, design, digital arts, and urbanism in this context can achieve positive impact, innovate, and be of benefit to community and society. Today, I particularly thank Marcella Del Signore for having conceived and created an event within the context of the Master of Science in Architecture, Urban Design, which addresses the theme of communities in a very engaging way, I have to say, through an extreme perspective of a potential, this is my interpretation of a planetary community. I'm therefore very looking forward to hearing more about this. I also want to take the chance to thank our distinguished guests, Jeffrey, Marina, and Ali, for being here with us today, the members of the lecture and event committee who have been collaborating to the series. And in this case, I have to thank twice Marcella, being part of the committee and very supportive in the organization of the events. And of course, Susan Sternberg for her invaluable continuous support in the organization of the event. I will leave you to the stage to you, Marcella, so you can introduce our guests and the topic of the event in more detail. Many thanks.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome and good evening to our guests, to our students, faculty, alumni, colleagues, and friends. So thank you again for being here tonight. Welcome to the Territory of Planetary Urbanization event, supported by the Master of Science in Architecture Urban Design program. I'm Marcella Del Signore, an associate professor and director of the MS in Architecture Urban Design at New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design. The Territories of Planetary Urbanization event tonight traces new concepts and emerging horizons for different ways to inhabit the planet, vis-à-vis current challenges and opportunities that emerge from technological, environmental, and socio-cultural domains. The planetary is understood as relating to or belonging to a planet or planets, and relating to the Earth as a planet. In the planetary, many parameters are at stake that reveal not only the singularity of their actions or influences, but on the contrary, the complete codependencies and the entanglements of bodies. Codependency, coupling, cause and effect determine the deployment of such systems and their mutual influences. As planetary scale reproduction occurs, increased levels of anthropogenic mutation exponentially count the homogenization of urban forms and public realms. This condition makes us reflect on the interdependency of such systems that, voluntarily or not, are terraforming the planet. The formation of Earth is a process that has taken place over millennia. As production and reproduction of urbanization continues, this process has to be seen holistically as a process of continuous transformation of Earth system. And this process is inherently and deeply connected with the anthropogenic and resulting from it. The event tonight will explore the impact of planetary scale urbanization on the technological, environmental, and socio-cultural domains, and strategies to plan for future urban development at the planetary scale and beyond. We're very pleased to have an amazing group of speakers tonight. Thanks again for being here. Tonight's event participants at the roundtable discussions are Jeffrey Nesbit, H. Dean Pierce Endowed Chair at Texas Tech University College of Architecture, Marina Alberti, Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning, Director of the PhD Program in Urban Design and Planning, and Director of the Urban Ecology Research Lab at the Department of Urban Design and Planning at the University of Washington. Ali Fard, Assistant Professor in Architecture and Urban and Environmental Planning at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Thanks again all for this participation and accepting this invitation. So we really look forward to your presentation and the discussion afterward. So we're ready to start with the first speaker. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jeffrey Nesbit, H. Dean Pierce Endowed Chair at Texas Tech University College of Architecture, Jeffrey will present notes on extraterrestrial. Well before Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to complete an orbit on the Earth in 1961, experts had considered how humans might escape failed system in space travel. Renowned rocket engineer Wernher von Braun envisioned an emergency escape capsule in early 1950 to protect astronauts in the event of a post-launch emergency. As the bailout is determined inevitable, the crew initiated the eject button and chemical powder would ignite a small charge, forcing the capsule to slide out of its rocket chamber onto rails. Discharged from the abandoned spacecraft, the capsule would then drop back down to Earth with the crew securely enclosed inside. Several cutaway renderings by American commercial illustrator Fred Freeman were used to illustrate von Braun's geographically remote and imaginary scenes of emergency and escape. The drawings included detailed representations of the apparatus interior and mechanical system necessary for a successful ejection. Rendered in full color, the spectacular illustration depicted von Braun's military-like capsule escape design. Crew housed inside the compact capsule seemed to maintain calm expression and appear to be wearing combat uniform from World War II. This talk suggests these early visions to generate a new American aesthetic for how we reach extraterrestrial space, but also anticipate for disaster. Jeffrey Nesbit is an architect, urbanist, and recently received his Doctor of Design degree from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Office for Urbanization at Harvard and founding director of the research group Grounded Design. His work focuses on the process of urbanization, infrastructure, and the evolution of technical lens. Currently, Nesbit's research examines the 20th century American spaceport complex at the intersection of architecture, infrastructure, and aerospace history. He has written several journal articles and book chapters on infrastructure, urbanization, and the history of technology, and is co-editor of New Geographies 11, Extraterrestrial, ACTAR 2019, Rio de Janeiro, Urban Expansion and Environment, Routledge 2019, Chasing the City, Models for Extra-Urban Investigations, Routledge 2018, and host of Nature of Enclosure, a podcast series on Urban Next. Nesbit currently holds the prestigious 2021-22 H.D. in Pearson Dow Chair at Texas Tech University, while previously teaching architecture and urbanism at several institutions, including Harvard University, Northeastern University, University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and University of New Mexico. Welcome, Jeffrey. Thanks again for being here. So we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Marcella, and thanks to my colleagues here. It's going to be exciting to enter into a conversation. I'm going to just start with a little bit of a preface to suggest that it's going to seem a little bit odd, this talk, in the context of my colleagues and the topic, but I want, as a precursor to consider this as a surrogate for contemporary challenges of urbanization, and hopefully we can flesh out why I've decided to present this particular piece. So the title is Notes on the Extraterrestrial, Territories of Technical Objects. On the day of launch, engineers and the Launch Control Center are ready. Rocket systems are go, and pre-flight checks are complete. Lesser known, an array of teams from the US Air Force and Navy are actively deployed across a vast terrestrial geography. Each Cape Canaveral launch since 1952 required an extensive network for tracking flight trajectories, which came to be known as the range. Rockets aim to fly over remote ocean geography to avoid any catastrophes on human-occupied lands. All but one United States launch site has been bound to major water bodies, like many major port cities around the world, but perhaps with differing reasons of remote geography and safety. Based on the Naval Research Laboratory from 1955 report, optimal launch inclination angles should be located between 45 degrees north and 45 degrees south, and argued closer to the equator allowed for greater efficiency in initiating orbit. Florida was not the southernmost latitude considered. In fact, Grand Bahama Islands was given serious consideration. However, time pressures deemed the site less desirable. Because easterly direction and the requirement for non-inhabited areas in the region of the rocket first and the second stage impact second, only the Air Force Missile Test Center is being considered as a launching point, and certainly accelerated over the following 5 years. Shortly after NASA is established in 1958, the range included over 90 sites with 13 tracking stations and stretched over 5,000 miles towards the South Atlantic Ocean. By 1961, an agreement was signed between NASA and the US Department of Defense, securing federal funding of the stations, integrating its systems, and employing personnel within the Eastern Missile Test Range. This Eastern Range enabled a series of recovery teams, such as military submarines immediately off the Florida coast and naval warships deep in the South Atlantic. With divers in the water, fleets of warships manned with rescue teams on standby, and tracking support stations live, the spaceport expands its footprint into a massive planetary territory for monitoring, testing, and tracking rocket trajectories. But this is not only a description of geographic configuration alone. By the time President Kennedy takes office, preparedness of NASA engineers and astronauts along with the military recovery teams included an audience on watch. Densely packed television cameras, bandstands, and cars parked along the sides of the highways services were mobilized to invoke a public audience nationally. Visibility of the technological prowess of the US space program is initiated not necessarily by the act itself, but the ability to view such acts and events at a national scale through broadcasting networks. Glued to television screens, the nation and the world anxiously views the rocket's brief trajectory into extraterrestrial space until reaching invisibility as the rocket enters outer space. Deploying submarines, warships, and rescue teams off the coast produce what Rainer Banham described as, quote, wilderness in search of gizmos, end quote. In the Cold War era, the United States amplified power by its tactics and use of the military's ability to monitor the globe in our increasingly closed world. The back porch technologist, as Banham described, mentality found in post-war American culture was brought into the remote planetary wilderness. Excessive federal economies provided massive military war power, signifying an abundance of American-made machines and economic stature, and open up boundless political territories in the Earth's oceans. The remote and invisible wilderness of the missile range sat neatly in the background of Cold War conflict and the American imaginaries in space. Rocket scientists early on imagined how to respond to the unpredictable disasters that may occur after launch. By the early 1950s, before any manned missions in space, we find an unusual vision for preparing for disaster. Renowned rocket scientist Wernher von Braun envisioned an emergency escape capsule to protect the astronaut crews in the event of an emergency after launch. If a disaster occurred before reaching orbital space, the crew was unable to operate the non-functioning spacecraft. The emergency capsule would allow them to be ejected from the rocket and would drop back down to Earth with the crew safely enclosed inside. Between 1952 and 1954, commercial illustrator Fred Freeman made several cutaway renderings to illustrate these imaginaries and geographically remote scenes of emergency and escape. The illustrations were published in the popular magazine Collier's as part of a series entitled Man Will Conquer Space Soon. Drawings include detailed representations of the apparatus interior and mechanical systems for a successful ejection. Rendered in full color, these spectacular illustrations represent the visions of von Braun's military-like capsule escape designs. Figures housed inside the compact capsules are drawn with unalarmed expressions and appear to be clothed in combat uniform from the war. Von Braun's visions are rendered for public view and project an American aesthetic designed for anticipating disaster. Of the series, one illustration renders a scene in which an emergency has occurred and the recovery systems in the Eastern Missile Range have been deployed. Carefully crafted, the drawing indicates a moment of crisis, but simultaneously describes a moment in geographic space. With the cutaway to show the interior capsule mechanism, mechanics, and the crew secured inside, all of the objects in the background of the scene describe a very different scale of extraterrestrial territory. Populated with military vessels, helicopters, and naval warship fleets racing to the rescue site, the background is nowhere, yet illustrates a vast expanse of the military's range and reach. The scene describes a placeless environment situated between the frontier of extraterrestrial space and the remote wilderness of our oceans here on Earth. The March 1953 issue of Collier's focuses on the event and describes the potential causes of emergencies in manned spacecraft. Entitled Emergency, Man's Survival in Space, and written in narrative form, the issue imagines possible risks and lists various solutions for recovery after a rocket's technological catastrophe. Emergency fires were of special concern, and of course, each of these instances had to be studied closely. The article proceeds to outline four, quote, real danger events, including fire, and goes so far as to suggest that, quote, luckily, fires are likely to be rare, end quote, and that, quote, if fire or explosion should occur, it will probably be on the way up, end quote. On February 21st, 1967, an electrical fire ignited the spacecraft's cabin, and all three Apollo astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were killed. No one had anticipated a common fire to ignite from electrical boards inside the space capsule. The rocket had not departed from the launch pad, nor was the spacecraft even scheduled to launch that day. Failure was found in the time it took for the door escape hatch to release, a problem that prohibited the crew from quickly escaping the enclosed craft. Had the escape hatch of the capsule been quickly released upon such an emergency, the astronauts may have been able to survive the devastating event. Despite this accident, the Apollo program persisted, and shortly after, the egress became part of astronaut simulations. Water egress was the most reasonable departure from the capsule upon quote-unquote splashdown. Apollo astronauts were trained in various simulation environments, including, as you see here, a swimming pool on the Ellington Air Force Base. This bizarre overlap of high technology with the American idealized landscape of suburbia presents simultaneous imaginary of modernized culture. We conceive the most radical events to occur on the boundaries of our planetary frontier, and yet those same dangers can occur in the more common enclosed environments here on Earth, without the glorified or most advanced missile technologies in history. The remote wilderness is not only shaped by transformations of failed gadgets and neotechnic processes, but more deeply embedded in the ever-expanding frontier of reaching terrestrial wilderness on and off the surface of Earth. And thus the spaceport capsule could be considered part of the American ideal in shaping the invisible wilderness, what Banham referred to as compact little packages found in American culture. On July 24th, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins reach Earth's gravitational pull and rapidly begin their descent back to Earth. With the three tucked inside, the capsule rotates its position to blunt end forward to shield from the flames when entering the atmosphere. Proceeding into a 4-minute radio blackout at an altitude of 65,000 feet, deployed U.S. military aircraft make visual contact on the descending capsule. 3 minutes later, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet identifies the capsule and speeds towards the recovery site, located 950 miles southwest of Hawaii in the North Pacific Ocean. Once the capsule reached 10,000 feet, three large orange and white parachutes slow down the capsule to land safely on the rough Pacific seas. Outside of the range, the recovery site demonstrates yet again the stage for discrete objects in the wilderness. Military helicopters and 2 warship aircraft carriers race to recover the crew from the capsule. but important steps were put in place to avoid any exposure of possible bat contaminants. Military divers in the water wore scuba gear with special filters to minimize contact of potential lunar microorganisms. As the capsule's hatch opens, biological isolation garments, also known as BIGs, drop down from the helicopter. Astronauts are wiped down with sodium hydrochloride, put on the garments, and assist rescue divers with placing all lunar rock samples into the remaining BIGs. But even the capsule itself is a risk. Quickly, one other diver closes the hatch and seals the capsule vents to avoid any further contaminants entering the Earth's atmosphere. Astronauts are then hoisted up to the helicopter and head toward the USS Hornet aircraft carrier. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are ushered directly from the helicopter to what's known as the Mobile Quarantine Facility, the MQF. While inside, as you see, the astronauts take showers, change clothes into flight suits, and anticipate the arrival of President Richard Nixon. Complete with professional lighting, a microphone on an elevated platform, broadcast cameras in place, and an audience comprised of military personnel, the global stage is set to celebrate the successful completion of the lunar mission. But curiously, the object of enclosing the quarantine facility is made from a common and quite ubiquitous frame found in post-war American consumerism, as we all know, the Airstream trailer. Silver Streak trailers proudly advertised. Their coaches came riveted with, quote, aircraft type construction, and quickly became the model of post-war recreational adventures in the American countryside. The Airstream became not a vehicle for entering the wilderness, but a discrete object to increase the distance from it. And not coincidentally, the duality of this Airstream to wilderness finds itself in the celebrated sequences of the US Apollo space program. There, sitting on the powerful military fleet in the North Pacific Ocean, with the nation's president at its side, it is both the three astronauts and the modified Airstream on display for the world to see. A synthetic museography of modern American culture located at the frontier of a previously invisible geography. Launch and trajectory to access orbital and extraterrestrial space creates perhaps a reciprocity or a reciprocal relationship here on Earth. Reaching beyond Earth allowed the US to increase its reach into distant and invisible geographies on the globe. Both the missile range and recovery objects used for anticipating emergency became the operative device that expands the range of geographic territory and invoke a public audience in the face of post-war politics. Discrete objects deployed for recovery tactics generate a vast geographic territory of control. And it is these autonomous yet mobile objects that become the ubiquitous tools for projecting an image of power over both the natural environment and blurred political territories on and off our terrestrial surface. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks for the great presentation and for making us expand beyond our planetary frontiers. So we'll talk more and I think some points for discussions afterwards. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Marina Alberti, Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning, Director of the PhD program in Urban Design and Planning and Urban Ecology, and Director of the Urban Ecology Research Lab at the Department of Urban Design and Planning at the University of Washington. Marina will present Building Cities That Think Like Planets. Cities must rethink themselves in the context of planetary change. What role do cities play in the evolution of Earth? Cities across the globe are changing Earth ecosystem by altering fundamental processes that maintain life and support well-being. Cities are not simply driving loss of biodiversity, they are changing the genetic makeup of many populations, including animal, plants, and microorganisms. Changes in species traits might have significant effect on socially relevant ecosystem functions such as nutrient cycling, pollination, water and air purification, and also food production. Alberti proposes a co-evolutionary paradigm for building a science of cities that think like planets, expanding the time and spatial scales of city design and planning to include the scale of the geological and biological process on which our planet operates. The city that thinks like a planet is not built on already set design solutions or planning strategies that are expected to equally apply across the world, regardless of place and time. Instead, such a city will be built on principles that emerge from expanding our scientific understanding, drawing boards, and collaborative action to include both human and planetary processes to position humanity in the evolution of Earth. Such a view acknowledges the history of the planet in every element or building block of the urban fabric. A city that thinks like a planet is simultaneously resilient and able to change. Marina Alberti is University Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning in the Department of Urban Design and Planning at the University of Washington. She directs the interdisciplinary PhD program in Urban Design and Planning and the Urban Ecology Research Laboratory. She teaches courses in urban science, urban ecology, environmental planning, research design, geographic information systems, and group dynamics and conflict resolution. Alberti's research interests are in urban ecology. She studies cities as hybrid ecosystems. Her research focuses on the interactions between urban development patterns and ecosystem function, urban evolutionary dynamics, and the properties of urbanizing regions that enhance their resilience and socio-ecological innovation. She leads research on urban ecological modeling, scenario planning, and strategic foresight. Her work involves the development of metrics and indicators of socio-ecological performance that can be used to monitor progress and inform policymaking and planning. In her book titled Cities That Think Like Planets, Alberti advances a science of cities that work on a planetary scale and link unpredictable dynamics to the potential of socio-ecological innovation. Thank you, Marina, for being here, and welcome.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction. And just need to make a little correction that I'm not anymore directing the PhD program because I directed for 12 years. And I now took responsibility to direct the Major Research Network to study urban eco-evolutionary dynamic. Because this is being recorded, I needed to make
Thank you. But
thank you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me here. This is a wonderful panel. Was very excited to hear this first presentation, and let me share the screen. I hope it works and you can see the screen, and let's see if I can make it full screen. Yep. Can you see the full screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. So thank you for having me here. And the main point of my presentation, which was already summarized, is that the global urbanization is driving a system transition in human Earth dynamic, which demands us as a planner and designers to rethink the city in the context of planetary change. Now, over the past century, the great acceleration of human activity has initiated fundamental Earth ecosystem shift. And these slides show the simultaneity of unprecedented changes in both socioeconomic and Earth system variables. And while humans have been altering ecosystem processes for millennia, the emergence of urbanization represents a major shift in both the intensity and scale of planetary human-driven ecological transformation. A transition that is reflected in the observable acceleration of many variables, such as the surface temperature anomaly. So cities are the most visible signature of the Anthropocene. It is widely known that urban areas with more than half of the world population generate more than 80% of the world economy and account for over 70% of global energy use and energy-related greenhouse emissions. What is less known is the significant shift that has also occurred over the last century in the dominant structure of urban regions, which have evolved from decentralized settlements to a polycentric structure, eventually giving rise to what we know now as the emergence of the urban megaregions. Oops. For some reason, I can't move. There are 12 megaregions in North America, 11 in the US, and they account for more than 60% of the metro areas and a population of 237 million people, 70% of the US population, and more than 75% of the US economy. And each of those regions produce economic output that is comparable to the largest world economies. The Boston-Washington megaregion, with 18% of the US population, generate 3.75 trillion with an economy greater than Germany. And predictably, each of those regions also produce carbon emissions comparable to entire countries. So what are the implications of such rapid transformation for our planet? What I argue is that urbanization represents a discontinuity in the dynamic of Earth ecosystems. As a region urbanizes, ecosystems functions decline and the system moves along the upper continuous line until a threshold is reached and the system becomes unstable, here represented by the dashed line. And as urbanization increases, multiple stressors further reduce the ecosystem function until the system flips into a new state governed by new dynamics. And to explain this concept, here I use a heuristic. The system here is represented by the ball. Imagine such as the hydrological system which controls the dynamic of a coastal city and which is maintained by mutually reinforced processes, which within a stability domain, here is represented by the valley. External shocks, such as the hurricane like Katrina or Sandy, can trigger a completely different system behavior, here represented by the new hydrological regime. So regime shifts emerge from the interactions between natural processes and human intervention, which modify the feedback mechanisms that, then maintain the system function within its stability domain and prevent the system to shift into alternative state. Now, historically, river deltas would shift location, expand, and contract depending on changes in the precipitation, erosion within a stability domain. But slow changes in the internal feedback caused by, for example, bank hardening and levees may change the domain of attraction from a resilient condition to a less resilient condition, changing the threshold that pushed the system into a new regime. For example, in Jamaica Bay, the wetland laws associated with land cover change and human intervention over the last 50 years has been a key to the increased vulnerability of the urban ecosystem to extreme events. So cities are changing the biophysical structure, but cities are also altering the rules of the nature's game. And specifically, what I'm switching now to talk about is how they are driving microevolutionary change. This video, which I hope it works, shows the challenges of anolis lizards in the urban environment of Puerto Rico, climbing artificial substrates. Christian Winchell provides evidence on the phenotypic shift of lizards to longer limbs relative to their body size due to the presence of those artificial structures. And there are many examples of evolution driven by urbanization, from songbirds getting tamer and bolder and changing their tunes to keep urban background noise from masking their acoustic signals, to spiders getting larger and even doing better in cities than their natural habitats. The water flea Daphnia has evolved tolerance to cyanobacteria and urban heat. seeds produced by weeds that grow in our parking lots have evolved to not travel very far compared to those that do grow in the countryside. Earthworms are well adapted to tolerate contaminants in soil. Fish have adapted to cope with poison like PCB in urban waters. Urban ants can better tolerate rapid increase in temperature. Urban foxes also have a smaller brain size. Urban foxes' school seems to be designed for a stronger bite rather than speed, as does of the rural foxes. And there are many other examples: cane toads, the white-footed mouse, various species of grasses, freshwater snail. And although we still don't know the ecological consequences of those changes, many of those species traits have important implications for ecosystem functions, such as biodiversity, nutrient cycling, seed dispersal, water and air purification, food production, with, of course, significant implication for human health and well-being. Now, the human, through urbanization, are causing microevolutionary change is not new. What is new is the evolution is happening at a very rapid pace, just a few generations, in response to urbanization. And the reciprocal interaction between ecology and evolutionary dynamic has the potential to affect ecosystem function. As shown here from the graph, highlighting how observed urban-driven phenotypic changes may cascade through the levels of biological organization and ultimately affect ecosystem function that support human well-being. Cities are altering evolution by reducing native habitat, altering habitat connectivity and heterogeneity, and introducing novel disturbances, determining which species can survive and generating also new biotic interactions. And there are a number of examples of heritable traits for which there is evidence that urbanization is altering those traits and how those trait changes may directly or indirectly affect the various ecosystem functions. And yet, despite the increasing evidence of rapid evolutionary change and the implication for ecosystem function, our view of biodiversity that inform design, planning of green and blue infrastructure have been predominantly static, aiming to maintain biodiversity as it is or at pre-urban conditions. So what I'm arguing here is that in a rapidly changing planet, to maintain ecosystem function, we must aim to promote evolutionary potential and evolutionary processes that support biodiversity. Green and blue infrastructure play a key role in mitigating the ecological impact of urbanization. For example, street trees, green roofs, bioswales, as well as constructed wetlands and living shorelines are examples of built environments that are designed specifically to mitigate impact and maintain ecosystem function. But as all constructed environments, they have unintended consequences. So do we need to expand our framework to include the evolutionary process if we must succeed? And why? Because green and blue infrastructure affect the evolution of species traits, then maintain the ecosystem functions that we aim at controlling and maintaining, and therefore can influence their performance. And those are some examples of observed trait changes in, for example, photosynthesis and free growth and plant defense that affect the ability of trees to capture carbon and mitigate air pollution, or the dispersal traits of plants, or the daphnia, they might determine the urban water pollution control, or also the adaptation of wetlands vegetation, which may affect nutrient cycling and food mitigation. So how can we do that? How can we expand our perspective? To begin with, we need to frame urban ecosystems as a coupled human natural systems in which socioeconomic and biophysical factors mediated by technology drive urban and ecological function and ultimately affect ecosystem and human well-being. we need to shift our paradigm from a paradigm of control to a paradigm that embraces change and uncertainty towards resilience and transformation. We need to build on principles and properties that enhance the system adaptive capacity. Now, there is emergent evidence from the study of complex systems which point to the key properties that expand the adaptation capacity and enable system to be resilient and to change. Heterogeneity allows system flexibility and the ability to function under a wide range of conditions, such as multi-mode of transportation. Modularity allows the autonomous functionality and the ability to contain disturbances and avoid cascading effect, such as the modular electric grid. Cross-scale interactions allow functional redundancy in the system and that add capacity where there is under contingency the need to create solution for service substitution. And that's, for example, from energy, water resources, or food delivery, other services. Early warning anticipate catastrophic event and allow the system to fail safely, which also allow the system to perform within the part of the system without failing completely. And self-organization, which resilient systems are also self-organizing in a sense of quality that is enable natural and social systems to change their internal structure and their function in response to external circumstances, but still be able to perform some of the human and ecosystem functions. In my last few slides, I wanted to propose that cities, in cities globally, we are unintentionally running experiment on how organisms and ecosystems may respond to future environmental change. So that means that today's cities and urban system can be viewed also as a microcosms of the evolution of an urbanized Earth under different scenarios, and therefore they provide us with an opportunity for exploring how the way we build city will shape Earth futures. In these last slides, I wanted to ask you to think about the future, because the future has significant implications for the choice that we make in the present and the strategy that we devise. I ask it to imagine the future of New York City. Do we envision a future that follows the current trajectory of development, characterized by further urban growth? Will cities cross threshold, undergo irreversible regime shift due to climate change? Will it adapt to climate change by investing in green infrastructure? Will the city be able to reinvent the relationship between the natural processes and human well-being? But more importantly, what I ask is what future we are unable to imagine. Can we imagine cities where humans are key player in the ecosystems and bio-cooperate and not simply biomimic natural processes? Cities that operate on a planetary, spatial, and time scale, that rely on wise citizens, not simply smart technology. This is what I call cities that think like planet. We must expand the time and spatial scale of city design and planning to include the scales of the geological and biological processes on which our planet operates. And the city that thinks like a planet is not built on already set design solutions or planning strategies that are expected to equally apply across the world, regardless of place and time. Instead, such a city is built on the principles that emerge from expanding our knowledge, scientific knowledge, and expanding our drawing boards and collaborative action to include both human and planetary process to position humanity in the evolution of Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you for the great presentation, and also I think adding 2 more topics for discussion afterwards. And thank you for introducing the process of evolutionary systems. So these are great key points for the discussion at the end. Thank you. So is our next speaker. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Ali Fard, Assistant Professor in Architecture and Urban and Environmental Planning at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. Ali will present Reframing Planetary Platforms. As the computational logic of digital platforms begin to dominate urban life, tech corporations are leveraging a planetary geography to exert ever more control over the organization of urban spaces, and to position themselves as a powerful actors in bringing about a particular vision of our collective urban future. In this presentation, it will be examined how the globally expansive operations of the technology platform entails a particular territorial hybridity that puts data-driven control and management of concentrated moments of urbanization in cities, in direct relationship with infrastructural extension and increasing operationalization of the non-urban periphery. From sensors to data centers, from smartwatches to the informal cobalt mines of sub-Saharan Africa, and from high-tech campuses to the so-called smart cities dotting the globe, the spatial imprints of data are deeply embroiled in the geopolitics of their host territories, while contributing to the territorial expansion of this planetary operational geography. Ali Fard is a researcher, designer, and educator. He's an assistant professor at the University of Virginia School of Architecture and the co-director of OPN, a design and research collaboration based in Toronto and Charlottesville. Before joining UVA, Ali was a research associate at the Urban Theory Lab at Harvard Graduate School of Design and held teaching position at the Harvard GSD and University of Waterloo, where he was a lecturer in architecture and urbanism. He served on the editorial board of the New Geographies Journal from 2013 to 2018. Ali's current research investigates the operational landscape of connectivity, the urban spatial disposition of information and communication technologies, and the urbanization of cloud computing. His research and design work have appeared in MONU, MA Context, Bracket, Azure, Platt, and Harvard Design Magazine. Ali is the co-editor of New Geographies 7, Geographies of Information, Harvard University Press, 2015. He holds a Doctor of Design in Architecture and Urbanism from Harvard University and a Master of Architecture from the University of Toronto. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you so much. All right, the real test. We all have good practice on it, so let's see if it works.
Working.
I'm assuming you all
it's
see
working.
my screen. Perfect.
Yes.
Marcella, thank you so much for the invitation and that wonderful introduction. I also thoroughly enjoyed the presentations by Jeffrey and Marina, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Tonight, I'll be mainly talking about, as evidenced by Marcella's description, about the intertwined relationship between narrative and material conditioning of the ground, which we can see within the operations of global technology firms. And I'll try to argue that unlike an accidental megastructure, as some scholars have referred to them, these planetary platforms are highly designed socio-technical entities that combine notions of technological sublime and infrastructural development to position themselves to essentially exert ever-expanding powers on urban environments. And really part of my work involves establishing a combinatory analytic lens that critically examines the spatial projects of tech in relationship to the ideologies and the narratives that they propagate. So I'm going to start with two Super Bowl ads. They are roughly 10 years apart, both of them by Salesforce, which is a cloud service corporation. The ad on the left, you see the cartoon versions of the Black Eyed Peas, which were big back in 2011, promoting a messaging service of Salesforce, which has now gone defunct. And on the right, by taking jabs at Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, Matthew McConaughey proposes Earth as the next frontier of technology. And what I find really interesting in both of these ads is that they highlight two very much foundational ideologies of technology. One, that technology can seamlessly and effectively respond to a whole host of social and political issues, which brings with it technopositivistic ideologies of progress. And two, that the ideology of the frontier is front and center, which has been at the core of techno-utopian thought for some time. And so for our discussion, the notions of technological progress and frontier are critical, since the same ideologies inform how technology firms view and act in cities. The city is treated as a frontier of data-driven projects that attempt to deal with a variety of socio-technical issues that are facing contemporary urbanization. From parking spaces to healthcare, nothing really seems to be outside the purview of tech. And in the background, a machinery of myths and marketing represents the spatial projects of tech as part of a singular, clean, objective, efficient, and transformative platform logic, which again further imbues the urban operations of data platforms with techno-utopian ideologies of progress that attempt to justify the colonization of everyday life through technology as a necessary consequence of responding to socio-environmental challenges. And here I'm mainly focusing on large multinational corporations like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, realizing fully well that these ideals are not exclusive to these corporations, but given their impact and given the scale of their operations, they become indicative of the rest of the field. But also, realistically, their platforms and the infrastructure they've set up have become the underlying infrastructure for a whole host of other smaller firms. In that context, tech sector strategists, now turned urbanists, position themselves and their platforms as harbingers of a new smart, even conscious paradigm of urbanism. An urban model in which every click, every sensor, every screen, and every AI platform is linked up to clouds of data that depend on infrastructural landscapes, material geographies, and operational landscapes that increasingly encompass the globe. Yet in all these cases, the urban projects of tech, and by extension the city, are portrayed as highly defined entities with clear boundaries, a wholly knowable, manageable, and ultimately controllable archipelago in a sea of an undefined periphery. Yet the power that tech corporations wield in cities is as highly dependent on the organization of the sea as it is the archipelago. And you can really see this within the spatial operations of large-scale tech corporations. For example, Google has spent more than $30 billion on its cloud infrastructure over the past 10 years. Amazon has spent $35 billion on data centers in Northern Virginia alone. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Facebook have invested so heavily in undersea fiber optic lines that their private networks bandwidth capacity now completely overshadows the backbone of the internet. And as the computational logic of digital platforms begins to dominate our urban reality, tech corporations leverage this planetary geography to exert ever more control over the organization of urban spaces and the people whose data they depend on. And of course, this is the enabling geography of the cloud. The hypervisibility of text spatial projects in cities masks and obfuscates an extended geography of extraction, processing, storage, transmission, and control that underlies the ideologies, practices, and forms of smart cities. This is the infrastructural space that mediates the urban operations of platforms and their data supremacy. A global operational landscape dominated by cables, data centers, extraction sites, tech campuses, and manufacturing plants that literally tether the cloud to the ground. Therefore, the takeover of urbanization by technology platforms, as described, is predicated on the buildup of computing resources and enclosure of material geographies that are often situated well outside of cities. Yet the image that these platforms present of themselves is one of peaceful existence with the environment. In 2012, Google released a series of photographs of its data centers, which up to that point had existed in a shroud of mystery. In addition to close-up shots of flickering lights and carefully lit rows of server stacks, the facilities were shown surrounded by mountains, rivers, and wildlife. The idyllic imagery attempted to strike a harmonious tone between technological infrastructure and nature. But the sublime imagery, the sublime imaginary of the physical imprints of the cloud recalled the disruptive quality of 20th century technology, which we have seen in Leo Marx's The Machine and the Garden, or Hans Holland's fantastical collages of aircraft carriers in landscape, interestingly, both of them from 1964. And of course, the juxtaposition is not an easy one to digest, but the technological sublime that it produces has been used effectively to portray ideologies of technological progress and frontier, which are central to the spatial imaginary of the cloud. And this is really what we need to come to terms with, the fact that the process of constructing planetary platforms entails a particular territorial hybridity, which puts data-driven operations and control and management of concentrated forms of urbanization, otherwise known as cities, in direct relationship with infrastructural extensions and increasing operationalization of the erstwhile non-urban periphery. Therefore, to fully capture the urban impact of technology, we need to construct a reframing of planetary platforms, one which goes beyond the city to situate its technical positivism within the spatial complexities of their construction. So as an initial step in this reframing, mapping and drawing the constitutive sites of data platforms and their contextual relationships can perhaps be helpful in producing a spatial understanding of the geographies that are activated through their continual expansion. And as a way of giving this some structure, I've roughly categorized the operational landscapes of tech into 4 territorial strata: farms or purpose-built large-scale data centers, pipes or the physical networks of delivery and control of data, mines or the extractive sites of materials essential to data devices, and enclaves or corporate headquarters of technology companies and their bounded smart city initiatives. And while putting this presentation together, I was debating how to go about getting into all of these various dimensions of the operational landscape of tech. And I thought it might be best to instead unpack one as an example. And to be honest, I picked the low-hanging fruit, which is data centers, or as I'm defining them, farms. So the regions and zones of the cloud are materialized through data centers, which are in turn grounded within the specificities of geography and location. Locating the physical infrastructure of the cloud entails a spatial logic based on a cocktail of economic, political, and environmental conditions. Whether a region is earthquake prone, bound to political instability, or climatically extreme, as well as factors such as energy reliability, fiber connectivity, proximity to major target markets, are all key deciding factors. In locating its nodes, however, the cloud has also followed in the footprints of previous rounds of capitalist spatial production. Data centers, more often than not, find themselves located on top of the ghost of manufacturing economy or within the spatial vestiges of the military-industrial complex of the Cold War. Beyond its locative strategies, a typical data center's defensive spatial moves use topography, vegetation, and hard barriers to cut it off from its immediate context while maintaining heavy dependence on regional infrastructures of power, water, and data. So we can see how space and its construction play a critical role in how the cloud gets grounded. As the workhorses of the information economy, data center investments have become attractive for states and cities whose economic base is moving from primary production towards service industries. North Carolina, for example, is among states in the US that have lobbied heavily for data center investments. Favorable tax regulations and relatively inexpensive land, as well as location and relationship to major population centers, have contributed to a kind of data center rush within the state. A rush that began with one of the first purpose-built Google data centers in Lenore in 2007, and which was followed very quickly by the likes of Apple and Facebook. Google's project in Lenore captures the intricate relationship between the politics of tech imaginary and grounded realities of their construction. As a previous hub of manufacturing, it used to be the furniture making capital of the US. Small industrial towns like Lenore present especially potent sites for grounding the cloud. Years of industrial development mean the availability of surplus infrastructural networks of water and electricity, as well as transportation, which are now available cheaply and in abundance as manufacturing has moved overseas. Inexpensive land and political willingness of local governments also are important factors and have translated to massive tax incentives for Google. This is just to show how the context of Lenore has transformed spatially through the ever-expanding footprint of Google's data centers. So we basically go from a single $600 million data facility in 2007 to the construction of a second facility in 2010, and ultimately arrive at a $1.2 billion data campus, which begins to spatially compete with the rest of the town. And while these spatial projects of cloud are always touted for their economic regenerative potential, their actual effect on the economy of these contexts remains minimal. Google's Lenore project was, for example, imagined as a vital morale booster, if not a full replacement of lost furniture factories. However, in reality, Google has only generated about 250 jobs, some of which were temporary construction jobs in the beginning, but also most of which are held by people that commute from outside the county. And this is in the context of more than 3,000 jobs that have been lost since Google came to town in 2007. So in conclusion, the intertwined relationship between narrative and material impact on the ground is a key to an ultimate reframing of planetary platforms. By unpacking the urban implications, spatial imprints, and material geographies that form the foundation of smart cities and artificial intelligence, we can begin to generate a critical framework for examining the real toll that the expansionist logic of digital platforms entails. The scrambling for resources and territory that this logic exacerbates is likely to create more territorial conflict, more social exploitation, more geopolitical strife, and more environmental degradation. Spatial reality, which is far removed from the frictionless egalitarian dream that propagates the base of technological progress. By externalizing these moments and hiding them behind screens, tech platforms essentially evade responsibility and avert attention from the grounded dynamics of technology and data. So in a sense, exploring both the social and spatial basis of the cloud's construction on the same plane reveals the environmental and social costs of data technology, that are not captured within the positivistic narratives of platforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you. Thank you again for another great presentation. I think here we add another topic for the discussion, expanding on the landscape, operational landscape of technologies. And so these are, I think, all these, key points and keywords to expand on our discussion. Again, thanks all the speakers again for the great presentations. And we open up now to the discussion. And so I'm very excited about the themes that have been raised, and I really look forward to the discussion. I will start with some questions, and then we open up to our audience. So I think that representation are, very different, but also complementary, I would say, in the way in which expand on the topics of the planet and beyond the planet. And I think all of them, I think, focus on process of making the planet through interdependencies, through connections, through system coupling. And from, I think, Jeffrey's presentation, looking at this interdependency in space and out of space at the interstellar level, extraterrestrial level. From Marina's presentation, looking at the interdependency between environmental ecosystem, how we adapt on evolutionary scale and processes, to Ali's presentation, looking at the technological scale. So the landscape of technology, the operational landscape of technology, but also the impact on the territory of planetary scale computation and how affect the cloud computing, how affects the physical making of city. And so also I think all the presentation makes us to reflect on another point, which is the simultaneity of scales of operation, no matter if we're looking at, a remote small village or the whole planet. And also propose the insights in the way in which we might, and this is also part of the discussion, inhabit spaces, city, and the whole planet through more an holistic vision. So how we start from an holistic vision and begin to reflect on the planetary scale, and how this, as we are designers, thinkers, academics, educators, how we might think, design, and operate. I think also how these codependent parameters, I think what is at stake here is the notion of the terraforming, how Earth is transformed, the adaptation of systems, the geopolitical and technological formations, how we have seen in the kind of cloud computing affecting Earth, or technogeographies as well. And also how reproduction, of course, I think it's a very important point in the sense of how we think at the planetary scale urbanization. There is a notion of reproduction that I think we can further discuss within in the discussion itself. And also, most importantly, I think all the presentation touch on this notion of the anthropogenic. So how Earth is transformed and changed by human activities. And so how do you see these processes of formation are taking shape now? And when we look at formation, we might look at formation at a smaller scale, but a larger scale as well, are taking shape now and might take shape in the near future. And what is the real impact of urbanization on the planetary scale on really three parameters: the technological, the environmental, and the social cultural domains? So this is a more general question that I think addresses somehow, I think, some of the points that were touched in the presentation, but also provides a question in relation to how we might operate, and we might think about how this process of formation are occurring now and might occur in the future. And I think going back to Marina, how the future might look like as well. So this is addressed to the three panelists as an open discussion.
I wouldn't dare go first.
Any volunteer? So it's a big question, but I think it can be broken down somehow, I think, also through the lens of some of the presentation that address, I think, this particular aspect to the three lenses.
maybe I will go first. I don't know. Just to get us going in the discussion, I think you outlined, I mean, exactly the various kind of dimensions and the scalar relationships that a planetary condition entails, and I would like to make sure that when we talk about the planetary condition, we're not only talking about a scalar shift, because these processes, as large scale and as globally scaled as they are, they influence geographies differently, right? So we ultimately end up with a planetary urban condition that is composed of uneven geographies, right? Depending on which one of these lenses we look at, whether it's the social lens, technical lens, and so on. And I think there is a very much an interdependence between these themes, but also between these various scales, as well as what's come before. So within some of my own work, what I found really interesting was this divide between the image portrayed of a revolutionary form of urbanism, or a revolutionary form of thinking about, you know, the role of technology within global dynamics. But materially, when you begin to dissect these uneven geographies, you find out that there is actually a lot of dependency on infrastructures that are already in ground, right? So in a sense, these developments are less revolutionary and more, to go with Marina's terminology, more evolutionary. They build on top of one another to create this planetary condition. So in a sense, we can also argue that the planetary is not necessarily new, right? It's the kind of the ultimate formation of a process that has been going on for millennia. I've already probably talked too much, but yeah, initial thoughts on that.
Thanks, Ali. Any other comments on that?
Please, Marina.
I will try. I realize that the type of problems that we are tackling today are so complex and that require the involvement of multiple disciplines. And that it's very hard, though, to speak across disciplines. I work with astrophysicist, ecologist, evolutionary biologist, statistician, anthropologist, archaeologist, urban planners. And actually it's very unusual for an urban planner to work with astrophysicists and think about extraterrestrial life, which actually is one of my interests, to understand whether other civilizations have occurred in other planets and tackle the type of challenges they were tackling. But the reason I raised this question about interdisciplinarity is that I feel very shy to speak in the context of in this context, because I don't have the language and expertise to address all the issues that, for example, have been raised here. And I really bring one dimension, which is perhaps new to urban design and planning, which is a rapid evolution, but it's still one component. But the main point of that my presentation made, and that I think is important to stress, is that, first of all, I think that we need to acknowledge that humans are part of Earth systems. That humans are part of nature. The humans are part of, they're not acting on nature or using nature. And that is an issue that I have with most of the literature in urban planning, where, or in urban ecology, where humans are seen as external agents who destroy the environment or use the environment. But I actually think, I think of humans as agents, as other species. They're different, but they're the same as other species. They are ecosystem engineers, perhaps are the greatest ecosystem engineer, and they are also producer, not just consumers as a species. So if we start to frame humans as a part of the system, then we realize that the time scale or the spatial scale of our existence goes way beyond definitely the city or the region or the country. It goes up to the planet, it goes beyond the planet. And expanding this perspective gives us a very different space. It's expanding the, what I would say, the parameter space of our actions, and starting to imagine the pathways to move from the current antagonistic relationship with nature and the planet to a cooperative relationship. And that's what I call now, bio-cooperation. And this is why I also insist that bio-cooperation is a completely different concept than biomimicking, because biomimicking assumes that you are not nature. You're mimicking nature, but bio-cooperating means we are part of nature. Species cooperate among themselves, and we can evolve a capacity to cooperate with other species in a way that and coexist with other species and create a totally different future. And this is why at the end of my presentation, I insisted to the point of what is the future that we are not able to imagine. There is not the projection on any of what we have learned and experienced in the past. And the other final point I want to make is how important it is to think about the history, both of the environment, nature, and the planet, but also the history of human interaction, how much we can learn. We are not the first to tackle the challenges of environmental change. So what can we learn from other society that we can use to rethink where we are expected to go? I don't know if I answered any of your expectations.
Thanks, Marina. I think, I want to just make a point. I think if we think at the history of Earth as a planet, Homo sapiens, so humans, is really a blink of an eye in the history of evolution, if we think about that, right? I think going back to your point of how we become aware of time and history that goes beyond humans as species, as one of the species inhabiting the planet. And so I think this goes back, I think, to also Jeffrey's presentation of becoming aware of what's beyond the planet and what might affect the planet, but also how, humans are part of it, but also, I mean, we are part of it. I think it is the level of awareness that we have in the way we habit or cohabit or co-produce. And so I think when we think about evolutionary processes within the way in which we think about planets and urbanization, definitely I think the awareness of time and how humans will be on the planet for how long, we don't know, right? And so, or when humans started inhabiting the planet and cooperating or not with the planet itself, I think poses an interesting question of how we can learn from the past and how we might then project to the future. I mean, there is no answer to this question. This, I think it's, it's more, and again, thinking holistically to me of how we look at this through from outer space, literally, I think, you know, going back to Jeffrey. So we look at these issues from outer space, and then looking at space as well, and how we are interdependent at the interstellar level as well. And so I think these are all, you know, issues, questions that, of course, is not about the answer, but it's mostly to me acknowledging the complexity that we're dealing with, and how we need maybe other systems to look at those issues, maybe another type of paradigm. Right, back Minister Fuller said, if we cannot resolve the issues through that lens, it means that you have to change the lens. Somehow you have to create another system that address it. And so I think the question is if we're trying to give answers through the system or the paradigms that we have now, or first we need to establish another set of paradigms in order to address this more complexity, not complexity, but these other issues are a more systemic, I would say, an holistic approach from outside.
Yeah, I think, first of all, you know, since I went first, I wasn't able to thank Ali and Marina for wonderful presentations. It's both intimidating and inspiring to be in the room with everybody here. I like the comments very much. I think one of the features of, perhaps instead of saying what's different about each of the presentations, one of the similar characteristics perhaps in each of the three is I have a sense it's targeting on where the discipline can intervene in our practice. You know, neither one of us talked about aesthetics. We didn't talk about beauty or an architectural history. We talked about a history that perhaps is yet to be written or is being written by each of us. And I'm seeing in all the schools, some of the major practices around the world, this is, I think, where we're heading. Formalism's over. You know, now it's time to consider where we intervene in these massive systems. I agree with Ali. It's not a question of scale, that now we have to start designing a planetary scale, perhaps, or Marina's version of like, let's learn from planetary practices and apply them to urban developments, I think is a brilliant idea. But it's perhaps about distance and where we intervene. And I think rather than thinking of scale, maybe it's the distance. And Ali, this might resonate with you, which is where's the administrator and where are the activities that are playing out in that landscape. In other words, who's at the control room, and then literally who's being impacted by those decisions from the administrator's perspective and view. And I think that's something that my work certainly resonates with quite well. So it might have seemed like a strange presentation, a historical, little glimpse of some aerospace history. However, I think we have a lot to learn about the practices of, look how much territory was occupied by a military intervention that we all perceive as this image of, a civilian space program. And so there's that, but I also think the question about technology in all three presentations is also a shared, perhaps a shared interest, which is what Marina said so brilliantly, which was, nature is synthetic and synthetic is nature. And through environmentalism, with Marcella had mentioned Buckminster Fuller, I think we quickly learned that the dichotomy of those are irrelevant. And what happens now is, how can we, perhaps think about intervention in slightly different ways. It seems like Marina is almost so detailed on particular species and the activity, which is, I love the video of the little lizard falling off it sounds terrible to say, but it's amazing because it all of a sudden opens your eye in a different kind of microcosm of an impact. I'm rambling now, but I just want to add one last thing. Is I was teaching a seminar last semester entitled "It's the Opposite of Leo Marx." So it's instead of the machine in the garden, it was called the garden in the machine. And my whole argument is that the entire planet is a kind of technical object that now, and rather than we're gonna just design the planet, perhaps, and Hashem Sarkis, was working on topics like this recently, which is perhaps now where's the intervention? No longer maybe the beautiful church in the middle of the square of town or the town hall, but perhaps these expanded ecologies in Marina's case, or in Ali's case, these expanded infrastructural territories that are completely stretched around the world. But
thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you. So I have.
Can I?
Yes,
Go
Ali.
ahead, Marcella. Go
no,
ahead.
no. Go. This is open platform.
Okay, great. I was gonna actually pose a question to Jeffrey, which I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I don't think it was strange at all. I kind of got it and immediately was enamored by that history. I was very much intrigued by the positioning of the technical object as being a planetary, either a condition or having planetary impact, which so you kind of outlined so beautifully, and then through the history of the capsule and then these various kind of elements, technical objects. I wonder if in your work, so it's very clear in your presentation that it entails a large geography, a planetary scale geography to make this possible. But also the after image, I feel like has a planetary reach, right? So for example, the technical supremacy of the US in the aftermath of going to the moon, right? Manned space flight and everything like that. That begins to create a kind of a global planetary dimension of powers, right? Which up to that point were divided between the Soviets and the Americans, and before that it was a much wider condition. So I don't know if in your work you also elaborate on the kind of the ideology of the or the ideological basis of this planetary reach, and how a technical object kind of survives through those ideologies, and how that scale of operations extends beyond the kind of the sites of these operations.
Fantastic question, and I really appreciate the kind words. Maybe the brief answer is that the technical object is one, a surrogate of, as you say, technical supremacy, power, and so forth. But perhaps it's part of the national image building practice. And therefore, what's really kind of peculiar, and I'm not the only one that has done this, but when you look at the artifacts of these practices and these kind of archaeological, in a way, archaeological subjects and objects for extraterrestrial or space programs, and so forth, they still contribute to a national perspective of interest that's purely political, and we see that play out quite readily. Part of my dissertation, I talk about aesthetics, but I talk about aesthetics as a condition that's meant to appear rationalized and economical. And even though it might not be a cheap constructed building, it's meant to appear as it's a cheap constructed building because they're spending tax dollars to pay for these things. And so on one hand, you have this architecture in the background, kind of like your data centers that are mute. They're meant to be kind of shells. Rainer Banham talked about the shell of American culture and so forth. And yet all the technology lives inside the data center in terms of the hardware. Same thing in the space program. We should have more conversations because I think there's a lot of overlap there. So, but what gets glorified is the capsule or the rocket, and yet that's, I would argue, is intentional, because if you start looking at the landscape that's actually occupied by these activities, it's much broader. And so the technical object becomes the symbol of perhaps technological achievement and maybe fear, right? Like that in the Cold War era, which we're kind of back in, quickly rising back, which is how do you instill territorial reach, and just like You're suggesting data centers, marinas, expanding cities, and so forth can all contribute to that.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I have more questions for the panelists, but since it's 7:30 here in New York, I want to first open up to the audience to see if there are questions from the audience, and if not, I go back to some questions.
Marcella.
Yes.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, for this interesting conversation. I've more than a question, are kind of 2 points that raises from this meeting tonight, which is the need of not only understanding the horizontality of the issue. So we are not only talking about planetary as an horizontal dimension, we are talking about planetary as a vertical dimension. And someone of you, I think, Jeffrey, you referred to the value of history, and other of you talked about that. And I think there is a lot to say in terms of, because it's not just about a surface and staying on that surface horizontally, but it's going in depth on some of the aspects in the history that were crossing topics that are recurring today. Sustainability is not our invention, we know that very, very well. Globalism also perhaps is not our invention. Our technical or our technicization of that is ours, but there was always there, the Silk Route and all those products, the slaves kind of routes were all way of being global. The colonialism is the first globalism in some way. So it's important that, Jeffrey, also you refer to a kind of an understanding of not only of the physical, geographical, ecological, and biological landscape, which are crucial, but also understanding how those are, and the presentation about the ecology and the lizard was amazing, this idea of, and I'm diverting a little bit, but this idea of a planetary city instead than a city. It's crucial because, I mean, when everything is urbanized, what is urbanization? When everything is landscape, what is landscape? But anyway, without going there, the point of having in some way an understanding not only of this physicality of things, but also of their connection and how those come as expression of political landscape, economical landscape, cultural landscape, which are so equally crucial, and how the synergy among those things can help us in understanding as some phenomena that we analyze in certain parts of the world have really roots and causes in other parts of the world, and in other people deciding, beside the people that are kind of feeling the effect of those phenomena. So this idea, that's also globalism. A decision is taken in US or is taken in Russia, and the entire world is kind of in some way affected from that decision. So that's the globalism, and also in a systemic way that is, I think we as researchers and academicians, but also as a student, we need also to understand the overall complexity and kind of metabolic connection among all these landscape across scale and topic, not only across established disciplines. That's behind the multidisciplinary approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Giovanni. I think this was actually going towards my next question somehow, and point that is looking particularly, I think, within the notion of urban metabolism and understanding the dependency of material, resources, and energy, and the exchange and the cycles and how things get remade and retransformed, etc. And so, but also how this is connected to metabolic processes specifically are connected to processes of consumption and production of material, resources, and energy. And also how these particularly relate to two things, capitalist model and models of power. So this, again, it's a big question, but I think all of you already somehow touched on this. I think where, going back maybe to Ali's presentation, I think when we look at technogeographies and we look at the politics of the cloud and how they inform and form urban territories, this is highly, highly political in the way in which, we go beyond the typical Westphalian model where we define borders of countries, right? And we completely redefine that system to looking at different type of jurisdiction in relation to how the territory is governed. And so this intertwines, I think, capitalist models, issues of power, and issues of production together. And I think within the metabolism notion of production, I think there is this idea of cycle that starts to come in, that also deals with time, deals with really the interchange between material resources and energy. So this is, again, it's an open question as well, and it's a comment and picking up on some points from Giovanni and expanding a little bit on looking at how this connects to capitalism and models of power. Again, I think through the three lenses that we've been discussing: environmental, socio-cultural, and technological. It's open to the panelists, but anyone that from the audience would like to add comments or questions.
I mean, maybe I can attempt to respond to the question through a couple of examples. One, and I think this deals with the socio-metabolic kind of relationships and extensions that you mentioned, that are still operating within the kind of the capitalist model. However, the kind of frictionless the image is, or the ideal is. So and this relates to some of the other kind of territorial strata that I have set up for looking at the footprint of planetary platforms. And one of them is pipes, what I call pipes, which is basically tracing the cables and connections that mediate our relationship to data, right? So data centers are by no means the only footprint of data, and cables play an important role. It's, you know, if we go based on this capitalist logic, they mediate the circulation, right, which is essential to capitalist reproduction. But in this case, data. And what I find really interesting, especially given Giovanni's comments, is the role of history and how a lot of the undersea cables that connect continents to each other are very much based on shipping routes that were actually quite perversely were set up as kind of as part of the slave trade, connecting connecting Europe to sub-Saharan Africa and then to US. But also how they begin to, even when we look at the terrestrial version of the cables, they begin to use the right of way that is set up by train lines, highways, right, as the places where they expand, right? So it talks about, it really points to the dependency of these networks to previous networks, but also to historical kind of conditions that enable those routes to emerge. And then very quickly, a second example is the idea of mines, right? So we tend to not associate high technology or data technology with mining practices. But in a sense, the devices that we use to interact with these platforms, even though they might be designed in California, as it says in the back of a lot of them, they are the kind of the lithium is mined in South America, jeopardizing indigenous kind of livelihood and access to water. The cobalt is mined in sub-Saharan Africa and informal mining practices that use child labor. The devices themselves are assembled and manufactured in China and Korea. So it begins to entail a global industry of mining and extraction that not only makes it planetary, but has different effects in various places that it touches ground. So even though it's designed in California, it affects China, Korea, South America, and sub-Saharan Africa.
So well said. and so clear, by the way. You painted a very clear picture of what Giovanni was I think getting at. And also going back to Marcella's comment, you know, it's hard not to think of Lefebvre when we're talking about productions and where productions are made and how spaces are created from those forms of production. And based on Ali's comment, it reminds me that, you know, in terms of not just simply extraction of materials, but perhaps where sites around the world are being exploited for central urban dense capital. And it reminds me of our probably mutual colleague, Mariano Gomez-Luque, who talks about how the towers, if you track the towers around the world and the history of the tower of the late 19th century and 20th century, late capital 20th century tower, you'll find the money, you'll find the planetary economy and so forth. And it also reminds me, Ali, you were talking about the lines of connected networks across the globe through channels of cables. It also reminds me of an example in Singapore that we probably wouldn't have Singapore if it wasn't for shipping routes passing through Singapore. And that's what financed the production of a kind of urban, as we traditionally would call it, an urban environment. And so Singapore is weird because then it's both Marina's city, but it's also a kind of concentration that's immediately associated and dependent on Ali's kind of lines of pipes, as you call them. So it's a kind of pipe city in that way. But Marina, maybe you have some thoughts also about that relationship of concentration, but also how it's connected.
I moved myself. Yeah, I actually, one concept I'd like to bring to this discussion that has a lot to what you all have said in the last few comments is about what is called telecoupling, which refers to the socioeconomic and social and environmental interaction between and among very distant places. At distance coupled human natural system places, so that a decision or a certain process that takes place in the United States has implications on a dynamic that takes place in other two countries. When you think about soybean, the import and export, or the production that is involved, which has implications about flows of energy, material, people, information, organisms, and also involves financial capital and also governance across the globe. And the agents now interact across the globe through this telecoupling framework not necessarily in a manner that we are used to think in the past, where there was a linear relationship among who was exporting and where are the consequences. So all the concept, for example, of ecological footprint was assumed that ecological footprint is that you consume in a country and you impact another country, but it's more than that. Telecoupling brings up a concept of agents now interact through a new set of relationship and networks, and shift power structure, economic structure, eliminate or alter the way we think about distance, and also the point that was made before about who is the controller and whether we are actually controlling anything, and who is taking the. Also, I'm thinking about equity implications of that, and how the political system plays a role. And one thing that also I want to bring in the table, and that this overall framework conflicts play a huge role. Conflict can shift the landscape, the overall landscape, as we are experiencing now. But, you know, like wars exist in countries even beyond what we are experiencing now, which completely alter those telecoupling relationships. So I bring this concept of telecoupling because this has been one of the new framework within which people in the field of urban, environmental, and land use change has framed the idea of what's sustainable.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks, everyone. These are all amazing, wonderful comments, insight, I think expanding on really the, you know, the beginning and the framing of this panel. I wish we had 2 more hours to continue the conversation, but I want to also open up to see if there are more comments from the audience. Or somebody, yes, here we see that raise his hand. So you're more than welcome to go live or put any question or input in the chat. So I see one hand here, Hanmi Cho.
Yeah, hi. I'm a student, and first off, thank you to all the professors for your presentations. One question I had was, do you think at some point the government has to get involved to shift this focus and priority from technology innovations to infrastructure and environment?
Short answer is yes. But as expanded as these platforms are, and you know, it goes back to the question of power, the power that the economic power that they wield over processes of urbanization means that it's increasingly difficult to not only regulate them and their operations, but also do something that counters their environmental and social impact, right? So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why, I mean, in my case, looking at technology companies, they have so much power and they are so much able to kind of position themselves in relationship to urbanization and within cities, is that the public ability of doing large-scale change within cities is decreasing rapidly. And that creates a vacuum which technology companies begin to fill based on the build-up of expertise, but also this, you know, planetary geography that they've built for their own systems, which now they're kind of marketing to cities. So I don't know if that answers your question, but again, I think government needs to intervene, but it increasingly is hard for them to do so.
I actually appreciate the question, first of all. So thanks for asking. My version of it is perhaps similar, but slightly in a different perspective, which is I wouldn't say no. However, when and I'll use my example that I shared today of looking at the history of NASA. Private companies have always been involved with the construction and the image building of NASA. It's never been a fully federally funded series of episodes. So when I hear people, and this isn't a political opinion, I'm just sharing observationally. When I hear folks say, well, now we've, you know, since the space shuttle program, we've seen privatization of space. Yes, that's true. But the privatization of space activities have always been there. And so perhaps in Ali's version, maybe it's the way regulation is played out and what impact it has on certain markets. And I think it's it exists. It depends on how you play it out. There's a theory, and I forget. Forgive me, I forget exactly the authors, but there was a theory of the only way to get out of capitalism is to accelerate it, and I think they were called the accelerationists. And there's a book you can check out, and it basically suggests that, as Ali mentioned, it's more and more difficult for governments to increase regulations over certain enterprises and industries. And maybe for the accelerationist perspective, it's no, well, let's just proceed to accelerate it, it'll flame out, right? And then other systems will emerge. And so I think a lot about your question very much, but it's a difficult one because, of course, we all want to say yes, but as Ali properly said, it's becoming more and more challenging.
Can I ask a question?
Okay, go ahead.
I really appreciate your presentations. I enjoyed them a lot. I have, like, Giovanni also mentioned about the importance of history. At NOIT, we teach the, like, global history these days. And we study, like, the way we go back, like, 9,000 years before, like, we talked about Katahuyo, all these, like, going back quite a lot. And then we talk about the importance of environment and then connections of, like, between different cities, different groups, different people. So we try to show students, like, global perspective. But at the same time, global perspective is a little tricky thing, how you see it and then how you approach it. Probably you heard about this book by David Graeber, like The Dawn of Everything. Anarchists approach, like, the beginning of humanity differently. And some people think, like, humanity was more like an animal. Some people think humanity were like, people were very, very egalitarian from the very beginning. So, like, I understand, like, the importance of planetary urbanism, because we need a different mapping. We need to see our Mother Earth or the surrounding world, like, probably the universe, like, differently. But what's going to be the next step? Like, probably, like, you presented, probably, like, you see the situation, probably we agree on the situation, but at the same time, how can you fight against? Or mapping itself can be a goal, but at the same time, like, how can you move forward after this?
Small comment want to make here. I think this is a very good question, because it seems like we're thinking about globalization or global or planetary visions as moving at a general level. No, the way is to actually unlock or reveal connections between the very local, the action of each individual or community, the local block, the local neighborhood, and the planet, and perhaps beyond the planet, is to reveal that connection. This is why the lizard that I showed, or the earthworm change matters to global processes. And the pandemic is a good example of how a virus and the microbial changes that were happening in the world are a good example of how our connections with the planet have changed, and the power of the local micro element of this overall system. So you're right, what we need to understand is what are those connections. We need to build a discipline of planning, design, or architecture that is able to reveal those connections.
In other words, I love the response. The question's fantastic. As a design, I think most of us are in the design fields, and it's a question that I think is an increase since certainly environmentalism in the 1970s, where how does design, where's design's responsibility? And I think if we stop suggesting it's lays on someone else's shoulders, and Marina's point earlier about interdisciplinary work, we like to use that word a lot. It's really hard to do. It's not something that we've figured out, and I would say that would be of interest for me, particularly is I continue to try to work with, of course, designers, but also folks that I learn a whole lot from that will impact the decisions that I make in a design project. And the other point to make is we don't need to save the world in every project. We're not going to. I think designers, architects particularly, have an arrogance, history of arrogance that suggests that certain decisions we make all of a sudden will dramatically change the world for the better. I think that should go out the window. And so perhaps my answer to you would be incrementally and within reason, and making smart decisions along the way as best we can.
I think, thank you, Jeffrey and Marina. Both of those comments make a lot of sense to me, and thank you for the question. I would just continue with what Jeffrey was mentioning, the idea of spatial determinism that I think pervades our disciplines. And I'll go back to Keller Easterling's provocation that given the scale and given the impact of these planetary systems, architects and designers are very much under-rehearsed within the processes that are taking place. In a sense, as she articulates, urbanism becomes infrastructural, right? So it comes out of the domain of a designer, and it becomes part of the economic and financial instrumentation of territorial expansion. So, but that doesn't mean that there is zero agency. I actually think design research, right? Parts of it is mapping, but also parts of it is this multi-scalar ability to synthesize narratives, synthesize, various spatial and material dimensions of design projects. So if design is not being done by designers, especially within the field that I'm working on, designers can be the critical voice and provide their agency in creating this synthetic understanding of that system as a way of not only criticizing but also forming resistances towards these planetary scale systems. I said systems like 20 times there, sorry.
So I think it's interesting, that you mentioned Keller Easterling, because she really talks about design as medium design. And so when she talks about medium design, basically we almost take out the pressure of design as we intend design, and we look really at these larger infrastructural modalities, let's say, of operating. So I think this notion of medium design, and I'm going back to Jeffrey's point, is that it's true, we don't have to save the world with every project, but I think we have the capacity to, I think other disciplines as well, right? How we put the pieces together, I think can be disciplinary, could be a disciplinary question that opens up to interdisciplinary influence, let's say. So I think how we put the pieces together, to me, becomes a disciplinary question. And then how we engage and open up to other disciplines, that's also part of the medium design ways of framework, I think, of operating.
And I will add that sometimes we don't want to, don't need to save the world. We now just need to make clear the problem and to give form to the problem on that saved.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add, for example, Saskia Sassen talked about this global situation in the global South, caravan people during the Trump administration, people coming up because they lost the land to multinational corporations, and then the money just moves around. And recently there was seizure of Russian oligarchic properties in the United States. Many of them actually in New York City, in the needles too, right? The needle towers. So our urbanism is built in New York City, and then displacing people in the South, and then owned by some foreigners. We don't know who they are, but many of them Russians, Chinese, right? So all connected. So in that case, the buildings designed by famous architects, of course, Sharp, Jean Nouvel, many of them. So design needs to actively get involved. And then also this is design issue, but at the same time, it becomes political issue as well. It's all connected somehow. So a concerning thing is how can you respond to the situation? How we can create different network of probably sustainability or survival, saving the Mother Earth. It's just how we can save spaceship Earth. Otherwise, it's exploited continuously. So there was more from my level, it's a chip shot, but I think there was I was thinking of.
Maybe it's not going to be saved, or maybe not now, in the future, we'll see. Yes. So I see we can take one more question, and I see actually one hand raised by Paolo. I don't know if you want to still pose the question, or anyone else from the audience.
Yeah, I have just a quick question. Thank you for the presentation. It's a really good discussion, but I was just curious to know if the current narratives and debates within planetary urbanization, do you guys think, or does this panel think that it's tend to be more global north centric in terms of the discussions with planetary urbanizations? I know we've mentioned different systems, and a lot of that also the modes of productions are, you mentioned, coming from countries in the global south, but then in current narratives it tends to be, as far as the narratives and the literatures that I've read tends to be a little bit more global north centric. And I'm curious to know if what do you guys think about that, and sort of what is the current position of global south and sort of the systems of the global south? Especially, we've also mentioned sort of politics, the politics of this, so emancipatory politics of planetary urbanism. So I'm just curious to know about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Paolo.
It's a really sharp question, Paolo, and I don't have much to say because I'm gonna have to think about it. But I do want to just respond with another question, which is the study of planetary urbanization wrapped in the forms of Western Empire or Western Empire building? I think that's part of your question. Super interesting. I'm gonna have to marinate on that one. The one thing I can say is I had a recent conversation with a wonderful architect, Chat Pyong. He's a architect in Bangkok, and his entire practice is dedicated to questions and issues of ecologies, social questions in Bangkok specifically. He is from Thailand originally, but his education is, I think he went to Berkeley for undergrad and perhaps the GSD. I'll be corrected once you Google his name, but the one thing I can say is that we do find resistance in our practice, and Chat is doing that. And so he doesn't take commissions. He doesn't take projects outside of, certainly not outside of Thailand, but rarely outside of Bangkok itself. And so he's dedicated his practice to resist these temptations of neoliberal capital markets that have driven developments, in cities around the world. And so that's just, it's not an answer, but it's an example of what I've seen most recently of practice going up against that, and how you can kind of resist the temptations of that empire building. But I'm going to lean on my colleagues to give a more proper response. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and Jeffrey, that was a good response. I would also say that, you know, I myself, I feel I'm guilty of focusing too much, even though I talk about planetary platforms, I focus a little bit too much on North American footprint of these platforms. But one thing that I find interesting within planetary urbanization literature is the relational lens that allows for the highlighting of these uneven geographies, right? So even though a lot of the discourse tonight revolved around North America or Western cases, I would argue that the critical lens that comes from the literature of planetary urbanization allows for pinpointing where there is inequalities, right, within the system, and then those ultimately become sites of further investigation, right? The other thing, I think we shouldn't necessarily think of planetary urbanization as a universal theoretical body of work, right? One of the kind of the main aspects of it is that it actually talks about these unevenness geographies. So in that sense, I feel like it does show, it does allow for that kind of investigation to happen. It was kind of a non-answer. Sorry, Paulo.
I wanted to interject just a minor comment, but I agree with both the question. I think it is a very relevant question, and the answers they were given. My point here is that not only it's completely clear that planetary urbanism is framed from a Northern European American perspective, from the north of the world, but is and practiced. But we also don't know how to address the issue of bringing in the global south, because even the debate on the global south that I hear in the literature is framed in a northern perspective. And it's pretty hysterical, if I could say, that we talk about the global south, but we actually frame the problem from our standpoint, because it's our guilt that we feel. Whether, for example, the question is not just bringing in the global south in our debate, but it's actually decolonizing knowledge, colonizing research methodology, language, giving space. So the only way I can think the transformation that we need, and not only in the field of urbanism or architecture, but in ecology, evolutionary biology, and this is one of the topics that we're actually discussing, is how to give space to the global south to speak their own language, to frame the problem. So I'm going to stop here.
I think decolonizing research is the next topic of our panel discussion. So I would like to thank everyone. I would like to thank our speakers, Jeffrey, Marina, and Ali, for this wonderful presentation and wonderful insights, comments. I would like to thank the audience for being quite active. And I really hope that this conversation will continue in different formats, formal and informal formats, and will continue to expand and think about the past, present, and future. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marcella.
Thank you.